3000 NFL mock draft.
3000 NFL mock draft.
With your friends Kenneth and Rob. Talking about the NFL draft and the Seahawks. 3000 NFL mock draft. 3000 NFL mock draft.
All right, this is 3000 NFL mock draft. And I am one of your hosts, Kenneth Arthur of fieldgoals.com, Rolling Stone, the AV Club, blah, blah, blah. We are, with me as always, is Rob Staten, SeahawksDraftBlog.com, and, this is the weekly draft podcast where we talk about mock drafts, the NFL draft, college football, the Seahawks, as it all pertains to that. And, Rob, it seems like today is sort of a mock draft Monday, a lot of new mock drafts coming out. I know you say yours is coming out maybe in a day or two. Any initial thoughts of all is there one overarching mock draft story that sort of surprised you as far as where people are landing?
There's not kind of like one sort of big angle that is kind of sticking out right now, apart from the fact that I think that everybody believes that Jared Goff is going to be the number 2 overall pick, except for me. So I'm still kind of like, I'm still hitching myself to the Paxton Lynch bandwagon, which I think a lot of people have kind of got off. There's maybe just me on there right now. But that's fine. It means I can probably play the music that I want to play in the bandwagon, and no one's going to complain about it. So maybe I could play our theme tune, Kenny, which I'm
Sounds good to me.
I'm sure will have surprised John.
Yeah, we do have a great guest today, John Ledyard of USA Today, as well as the draftwire.usa.com, covering all the draft, doing a great job. And I'm looking at his mock draft now, and here, John will learn this here in a few moments, I suppose. But I feel like my go-to guru, being Rob Staten, his opinions do not always line up with the national opinions. In fact, I'd say that they're somewhat off in certain areas where they don't line up. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to April or May or wherever they want to place that draft every year, I think Rob is more accurate than all the rest, and he doesn't want to fit in with the idea maybe that Vernon Hargraves is a first-round pick, and he doesn't believe that Sean Coleman will fall out of the top 20, and we'll see what happens. And I'll say that John's mock draft, which you can see that came out today, is much more in line with Rob's ideas than I see with many of the other national ideas overarching pertaining to many of the draft prospects. Maybe it's not going to line up every single time. Maybe we can convince John to think a little bit more this way, and then his as well, vice versa, can do to us. John, thank you for coming on.
Hey, thank you guys for having me. I'm excited about it. I'm looking forward to talking some NFL draft with you guys.
Absolutely. My first question, I guess, is, and you must get this all the time, any relation to the 1700s explorer John Ledyard that I came across while I was researching you?
Yeah, absolutely. He's a great grandfather or whatever. I don't know, but we're definitely related. I think all my grandparents, they have tons of books about him, and so we are related. It's just obviously extremely distant.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that you didn't have any pictures together with him, but
no, I don't. I wasn't able to. Yeah, they didn't have Instagram and that stuff back then, so.
Right. Speaking of Instagram, people were probably using Instagram at the Senior Bowl. That's my transition. That's all I got. Last week you were at the Senior Bowl. You were at the practices. I read some of your notes as far as guys that stood out to you, and I'm kind of curious if you could expand your thoughts a little bit about some of these guys, because they might be, coming across to the Seahawks. I don't know if this guy, he's not going to be available when the Seahawks are drafting, but he's been flying up Rob's board, and then we've talked more and more to him every week. Noah Spence, Eastern Kentucky. How high do you think Noah Spence could go in this draft?
Well, yeah, it's a really good question, and I think going into the week, I wasn't quite sure because there are the off-the-field issues, but I think a lot of teams feel a little bit better about those and a little bit better about where he is as a person. I think Urban Meyer's vouched for him, and his coaches at Eastern Kentucky have vouched for him. And so I think that he's definitely starting to, jump some hurdles, I think, maybe with teams in that process in terms of his off-the-field, condition at this time. But I think that in terms of on the field, I was wondering, if I would see counter moves, if I would see the ability to win with power. I was wondering what kind of attitude he would bring to the field. Here's a guy who started out at Ohio State, was basically kicked out there and forced to go to a smaller school and reestablish himself as a prospect. Pretty much was undraftable just based off the things that had happened off the field and kind of where his character was at. And so, he took that process seriously by all accounts. He's, prescribed his own drug testing, random drug tests that he has guys perform throughout the week that he doesn't know when they're coming, just to keep himself accountable. So he's taken those necessary steps. Now I wanted to see how that translated to on the field. And from the very first day of practice, from the very first time that they were hitting out there, he went out there with something to prove. And it did not stop all the way through the Senior Bowl game. I mean, he and Georgia tackle John Theus getting into it, getting in each other's face mask right in the first practice. Spence just brought the nastiness all week. His ability to bend the edge and get off the line of scrimmage with great burst, I anticipated. I was really impressed to see him be able to use a one-arm power rush and be able to keep offensive tackles off his frame and counter back inside when they overset and take the rush lanes that were available to him rather than just trying to win the same way over and over again. So that variety that he brings off the edge, the ability to do it from a two-point stance and with his hand in the dirt, I think that's going to attract a lot of teams. And I think at this point, honestly, as long as his workouts aren't disastrous in any way, and as long as his off-the-field stuff stays clean, I think we're talking about a top 10, top 12 prospect for most teams.
Hey, I've got a kind of an interesting story about Noah Spence today, Kenny. I actually got a message from his dad congratulating me on writing a very positive thing about his son. Not that Spence Senior has a horse in this race at all. But yeah, he noted that. I just wonder, John, when we look at this draft class overall, there seems to be a lot of bigger guys. Like Joey Bosa's a fairly sizable defensive end. The two guys at Clemson are pretty big. Is there anybody else like Noah Spence? And do you think that the fact that he's maybe unique in that way in terms of his skill set will probably help him in terms of where he's going to go maybe in the first round?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Rob. I think that's one of the things. I mean, even if you look at last year's class, we had 3-4 edge guys, 4-3 edge guys. I mean, you had every type of edge defender, outside linebacker, defensive end, 3-4 guys that you wanted. And in this draft, you look at the first round, and I think Joey Bosa is just a 4-3 defensive end. He could maybe two-gap a little bit, but there's no point in using him that way. I think you want him in a 4-3 spot. I think you want Shaq Lawson in a 4-3 spot. And now with Carl Lawson going back to school for Auburn, I mean, those four guys, those three, and Noah Spence were the top edge rushers. So now you have three guys, and I really think Noah Spence is the only one that can play in that 3-4 odd man front and stand up and rush from a two-point position consistently. The other guys can do it in spot situations, but I think Noah Spence is the only guy that projects to kind of a full-time role in a 3-4 defense. I mean, you look at a guy like Leonard Floyd from Georgia, and there's some things he could bring off the edge, but he's light and he's more raw than Noah Spence. He's just going to try and win the edge most of the time. So a good player, but definitely not in the same realm of skill set I think that Noah Spence brings to the table. So, yeah, I think in this class he's unique. In last year's class, we would have had him amidst all these other these other edge rushers. For me, he still would have been first even in last year's class, which had some very good edge rushers. But I think this year his value is even greater because he is far and away the best 3-4 edge guy who also can play with his hand in the dirt and give teams that versatility up front. So, yeah, very, very rare skill set in terms of the 2016 class is what Noah Spence brings to the table.
John, I heard you on the Chris Burke's podcast just after the national championship game, and you talked about Mackenzie Alexander being your favorite cornerback in this draft at that time. In your latest mock draft today, I see Mackenzie Alexander going 29th to the Cardinals behind Vernon Hargreaves, and I'm curious for two things. One is, do you believe is that just your opinion on how teams are valuing Vernon Hargreaves versus Mackenzie Alexander, and it's just they don't line up with your thoughts? Is that because you do think that maybe Hargreaves could be better now? What exactly led into that, and do you really is this at least a deep draft for a cornerback? Because I know the Seahawks will be looking for something. Is it at least a deep draft? Because it doesn't seem to have a lot of top-heavy talent.
Yeah, a good point. I mulled over that as I did my mock draft today, and a couple of things. I think that cornerback in general in this year's class, like you said, I think it's a deep group. I don't think it's extremely top-heavy. I do think Hargraves and Alexander are the top two guys, but I think you can find quality talent, especially if you're looking for nickel corners. There's a ton of those guys with the quick feet and the ability to play inside. So I think that teams won't value corner quite as highly, and I think that Hargraves' size and Alexander, I think he's going to test fine. I don't think he's going to test great. And we'll see how he does in the interview process. He's a very brash, polarizing person, and some teams may be turned off by that. So I love that personally in a corner. I think it aids the way that he plays the game, the mentality he brings to the field very well. And some teams are going to value that. So the way that the board fell in this mock that I did, I just didn't see a natural fit with him before where he ended up going to Arizona. And so I mean, it's quite possible that a team obviously would take him, but I thought a lot of the teams that might like him had more pivotal needs at other positions, and so the way that the board fell, he just didn't happen to come off the board before then. I still have him slightly over Vernon Hargraves, whom I like a lot too, and I think is definitely a first-round talent. But when it came to the Colts pick, I thought they would value Hargraves' talent and Hargraves' abilities a little more than Alexander, just from an Indianapolis perspective. Those guys, especially looking for a guy who maybe will play in the slot a lot over the next couple of years at least, and a guy who could step in right away for a team with some championship potential. So I thought they would maybe value his NFL-ready skill set and not care as much about the size, because Indianapolis has taken smaller corners in the past and been okay with it, and they typically tend to play smaller corners, so I don't think they'll mind that. They like guys who are technically sound and athletic, and so from their perspective, I think he fits them. But for Seattle, I think that a guy actually, and I'm all over giving them this guy in the first round, I think that Jalen Mills, with the kind of week he had, making a transition a little bit from safety to corner. He played some corner at LSU. He played there his freshman year, and then he played in the slot a lot. He's probably more of a corner than he is a safety, and especially after seeing him this week, I really like his game. He's very physical. He'll have to learn press technique. He'll have to learn much more of that style of play. But he's a guy I could see them. I mean, they like to take some risks and do some things that people don't expect, and we see that almost every year in the draft. And he's a guy that I could see maybe his skill set and the mentality he brings to the field. He's had some off-the-field questions, and they've taken chances on guys like that with Frank Clark last year. So I think that a lot of the way that he plays the game represents the Seattle style of play in the secondary, and so they could use him in a variety of ways, and he could also potentially play in the slot. So I think he could be a guy that could be a wild card to them in the first round.
It seems like Jalen became a really popular baby name about 20 years ago. I've seen so many of them popping up in the draft now. Rob, I'm curious as well. What do you want to say about maybe Jalen Mills? I don't know if I've ever heard you talk about his skills.
Yeah, I think John is right to highlight him. I mean, the one sort of thing I would look with him is, is the arm length going to be enough for the Seahawks? They generally, I can't remember what Jalen Mills' arm length was actually as they measured him at the Senior Bowl, but they've tended to go away from quarterbacks that don't have 32-inch arms. It's just one of the little things that they have. They don't draft quarterbacks that are smaller than 5'10". Generally. So I just wonder whether or not I'd have to go and check the measurement on the arm with Jalen Mills to see if he kind of ticks the boxes for Seattle. But he's certainly somebody who, you could imagine them using, whether it was kind of like as a bit of depth at safety or whether they do use him in the nickel. That's maybe something they have to consider depending on what happens with Jeremy Lane. But there is sort of like a nice bit of depth overall to this cornerback class, and there's one or two guys who might actually rise up. I think Jackson at Houston and Howard at Baylor are maybe two guys that they could look at as well, maybe in the middle rounds. But if you kind of talk to many Seahawks fans, John, they don't want to think about anything other than the offensive line this year. And I guess they're not alone in the NFL. I suspect there's a lot of fans out there that are kind of looking at the offensive line play in the NFL in general and thinking, I hope there's some guys in there in this draft class that can help the team. So from what you saw at the Senior Bowl, and it's a great way for those guys to show off in those one-on-one drills, the defensive lineman, the offensive lineman. Who are some of maybe the offensive line guys that stood out for you, would you say?
That's a good question. There's so many. I mean, especially the interior offensive line guys. I think there were a number of players who I thought represented themselves pretty well. Seattle obviously could have needs at a couple different line spots, but quickly I think Josh Garnett from Stanford did a lot of good things. I think he's solidified himself as a first-round pick. I mean, this summer when I watched his tape, I thought he would end up being a first-round pick, and I've been pleased with the way that he's progressed as a player. Brings a nastiness to the O-line, brings a great locker room presence, all the intangibles you want, smart guy who's going to work hard. His teammate Blake Martinez told me he's one of the most attention-to-detail guys on the Stanford team this past year and over the past several years. So he brings a lot that you like to the table. Cody Whitehair is a guy that I could see that I love and I think will fly under the radar and could definitely be available in the back end of the first round. And maybe even early in the second round. Not going to wow anyone maybe with his movement skills or anything like that, but probably the most technically sound offensive lineman in the draft. Very strong hands, always keeps his feet moving and has a really strong base. You're not going to see him get pushed around a lot. He knows how to angle block. He knows how to get to the second level smooth and combo block and all those different things, and can run in zone and power schemes equally adept. I think Seattle could be looking at a center. I mean, they kind of went back and forth at the position a little bit this year, so definitely options that could be there. I love Nick Martin from Notre Dame. I think that people are still kind of questioning about his injury, but I thought this week really should clear things up for teams. I mean, he moved great. His hands are so strong. When he shoots inside, he gets a grip, it's over. He's got a great anchor. He's more than capable in space at the next level, I think. Can also operate in a variety of schemes. I like his game a lot if you're looking for a center in the later rounds. There's a lot of centers to be had in this year's draft. I would have loved to have seen Ryan Kelly from Alabama available at the Senior Bowl, but he chose not to participate. But just a couple guys that I saw. I mean, Jack Allen, another one. He's a little bit undersized from Michigan State, but the kid just plays well. You think he's going to be dominant. You know, he went up against Austin Johnson from Penn State, a guy I love who's 6'4", 320. He's going up against him and winning most of the reps. I mean, he gets pushed back a little bit, but anchor strong and always gets his hands inside. Really like his punch and a lot of the things that he does. And so there's plenty of interior offensive linemen to be had in this year's draft, I think, if Seattle's looking for him, even in the second and third rounds. Offensive tackle, a lot of guys with promise, but you're going to have to develop them. And Seattle's banked on that in the past. And I think Jason Spriggs is going to be off the board, but he's a guy I could see kind of fitting what they look for in a tackle. Highly athletic guy who can move and who can zone block and power block and fit in a number of schemes. But technically and consistency, it's just missing a little bit for him. And for a guy who started 4 years on the left side at Indiana, I worry about that a little bit, that he hasn't become more consistent at this point. The Cowboys coaches did some nice things with him this week, and I thought he improved as the week went on, which is a good sign for me to see him taking that stuff and putting it into practice. But a tough kid with really all the traits you're looking for. So just a couple guys there. I thought a lot of offensive tackles struggled too, but Spriggs definitely established himself as the best offensive tackle there at the Senior Bowl, despite his inconsistencies.
John, let's talk a little bit about the quarterbacks. I mean, obviously, that is the most important position in the league. You look at the guys that made it deep into the playoffs. You look at the Broncos, getting by despite their quarterback play, but still, and ironically having the best quarterback of all time, just not right now. Carson Wentz obviously was at the Senior Bowl this week. I mean, I don't think, obviously, if we're talking about the Seahawks, I don't think that, obviously, the Seahawks aren't going to draft a quarterback before round 2. I will say, I wouldn't be that shocked if they did. If a guy came in round 2, I wouldn't be that shocked at the end of round 2 if they said, well, we're going to develop this guy. John Schneider comes from, the Ron Wolf tree and all that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't be all that surprised at that point if a guy falls. But as far as the first round goes and this top 15, we heard us talk about it at the top of the show with Jared Goff, a lot of people having him at 2. I see a lot of people, yourself included, having Carson Wentz at 4 to the Cowboys, and then Paxton Lynch at 15 to the LA Rams. And I think that's another, overarching thought, is that the Rams are going to trade up for a quarterback, and that's something that, of course, affects the Seahawks in the NFC West, because if the Rams all of a sudden get a quarterback, they're going to be a really tough team to deal with. I'm curious where exactly you stand with these 3 quarterbacks. Which one do you like the most? Which one do you sort of feel is overrated and maybe will not develop into the best player between Carson Wentz, Jared Goff, and Paxton Lynch?
I think all of them are a little bit overrated right now because that's just what we do with quarterbacks. I mean, definitely all 3 are very talented. All 3 bring a lot of good traits to the table, and it's much more, people want rankings and they want who's, the most talented. and I think a lot of it's finding the guy who's best for your system. And I just think that Jared Goff's the most NFL ready, I think. Smart kid who is going to generally get the job done accuracy-wise, pretty efficient, is getting better going down the field. Doesn't have near the arm strength that Carson Wentz or that Paxton Lynch bring to the table, but definitely adequate arm strength. I think he can run an offense successfully, and he's learning to be a little more fearless with the ball. He's got great movement in the pocket. Paxton Lynch and Carson Wentz are guys that are cut from a little bit of the same cloth. I think both are great athletes. Everybody talks about Wentz athleticism. I think Lynch's might be even more athletic. And he's 6'7", and Wentz is big too at 6'6", so those are the kind of big pocket passing guys, but still mobile that you want at the position. So I think all three offer a lot and bring a lot to the table. I wouldn't want any of them starting week one for my team, but if I was going to go with one guy to start week one, it would be Jared Goff, but I also think he probably has the lowest ceiling. So he's the safest one of the three, I think, but if you're a team that trusts your coaching staff and you trust your ability to develop quarterbacks and trust the guy's skill set and strengths to fit your system, then I think that it could be worth taking a look at Carson Wentz and Paxton Lynch. And Lynch might have the highest ceiling of any of the three. He's got an absolute howitzer of an arm, but he's got to learn to throw with more finesse and more torque on the ball, or he's going to destroy his shoulder by the time he's 28, because right now it's just a fastball pitch. But I think in a lot of ways I like Lynch's traits the most if he can be developed. And since none of the three are a sure thing, and Goff's ceiling maybe isn't that high, I think if I were a team who believed in my staff and believed in their ability to develop a quarterback, and he thought that my team was, let's say it's Arizona, who was looking to find a guy who can threaten at all levels of the field, who has a big arm, who can make those tough throws in the windows, 20, 30 yards down the field. If it's that kind of passing attack, then I'm looking at Paxton Lynch. Now, I've heard whispers, and I won't say anything to slander the kid, that he isn't the leader, maybe, that Carson Wentz or Jared Goff is, so that needs to be considered too. But in terms of pure on-the-field potential, I like Wentz a lot, but he's not going to be ready to start year one, and if you try and start him year one, you could damage him long term. So I like his fit with Dallas for that reason, that he's probably going to be able to sit for a year, or hopefully be able to sit for a year anyway, at least a year, and if not more, and develop and learn what it's like to be able to read, because his biggest issue is processing quickly from the pocket. I don't think he does that particularly well. So in some ways, all three are overrated right now, but that's to be expected. We do that almost every year with quarterbacks. We need there to be a top-tier guy, and for NFL teams, there will be. NFL teams will have their own agenda. They will look at the position because of its value, and they'll think they can develop a guy, and they have to take that chance. You have to. You're dead without a quarterback. Cleveland has to stay at number 2, and they have to take a quarterback. They don't have any option. You know what I mean? So yeah. I think from that perspective, teams are going to evaluate accordingly. But for us as evaluators in a vacuum, I wouldn't put any of these quarterbacks in the top 20 prospects in this year's draft. It's not to say I don't think that they're good or they're talented or they can't, be great starters someday, but there's just enough of an element of risk that I wouldn't put them above at least 20 or so players in this class.
Yeah. And it seems like the Cleveland Browns at this stage, it's almost like when it comes to quarterbacks, they're like a guy who hasn't been in a relationship for a really long time, and he starts to overrate every single girl he meets.
Exactly. That's what it feels like. And Hugh's going to find his guy. I mean, I think they have, well, I've said this before, but I think that Hugh's the guy that, if they can give him any support and if they cannot screw up every draft, he's going to have a very clear structure in place for what he wants to happen and the kind of passer he wants. And I think Goff fits that. I think he's similar enough to Dalton and the success that Hugh had with Dalton. He's smart enough to be able to take Hugh's offense, which can be challenging, and apply it quicker than the other two, I think, quarterbacks could. And really it's about one of those three. So I think Goff fits the best. But I could see him taking, I could see him trying to stick around with McCown for a little while and taking somebody he thinks he can develop if he thinks that they'll give him a couple years of struggling in Cleveland before they fire him, but I'm just not sure that he'll feel that way given Cleveland's track record.
Kenny, I really wondered where you were going to take that Cleveland Browns analogy just then.
That's it. I mean, I'm more of I guess just because I relate in the Browns in that way. So
you end up taking the quarterback with the drinking problem. Was that, where you were going to go with that there? That they've I don't know. I mean, when you look at the defensive lineman as well, John. I mean, it seemed like Sheldon Rankins more than anybody sort of had a huge impact here. I'm sure that he wasn't the only guy that impressed in Mobile, but is there anybody else who sort of stands out? Because apart from offensive line, sort of the one thing that Seahawks fans generally feel that they need is someone who can rush the interior and can create problems maybe as a 3 technique. So is there anybody that stood out in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, you said it. Rankins was definitely the most dominant guy I thought there, and I expected that coming in. I'm a huge fan of his game, and huge fan of what he can bring to the table. Yeah, I thought that Jerron Reed was really intriguing. I mean, he's a guy I love, and I don't know how much teams will value him because he's not going to be an elite pass rusher. I mean, he's a nose tackle. He can two gap. You know, he could play 5 technique if you needed him to. There's no question in my mind, but he's just immovable. I mean, you can't double teams. It doesn't matter. You cannot move the guy off the ball. And there's going to be a team that values that greatly. I don't know when that'll be, but I just can't imagine him getting out of the first round. He's simply so good at what he does and so NFL ready that I can't imagine a team passing up on that needs one of those big runs. I mean, you think about Danny Shelton, and he went top 15, and it was Cleveland, so maybe other teams didn't value him that much, but you know, you look at Jerron Reed, and he basically can do what Shelton does, but at a much higher level and with much greater athleticism. So where do you value that? I mean, I would think pretty high. I know he's not going to be elite rushing the passer, but you know, he's going to help you win on first and second down. He's going to help you win on third and short. He's going to be a huge part of that. And so I think you have to value that pretty highly, and I love what he brought pretty much the entire week. I thought that he was, although he didn't maybe flash in one-on-ones as much as some other guys, I thought that he brought really just a well-rounded skill set the entire week coming from that defensive tackle position. I thought that a couple guys helped themselves a little bit. Charles Tapper, I wasn't really sure what to think of him. He looked like a power guy, run stuff in strong side, 4-3 end. Showed a little bit as a pass rusher. I thought he's got a nice rip move. If he just learns how to use his hands, I think he's very powerful, and he can win with leverage. He's only 6'2", so I think he's got plenty of sand in his pants at almost 280 pounds to be able to hold the point of attack and be a starting strong side 4-3 end. But teams are just going to want to see pass rush. You know, when I interviewed him and talked to him, he said, I got to show teams the speed element. I got to show them quickness off the edge in my first step and some burst. And I thought he was better on power moves than he was in terms of quickness and bending the edge, but there's enough there that some team could roll the dice on him in maybe the 3rd round or 4th round, and I could see him, if he can use his hands a little better, developing into a strong side 4-3 defensive end that can stop the run at a pretty high level moving forward. So just a couple guys. I think Sheldon Day is really intriguing. The Notre Dame defensive end, defensive tackle, where do you use him? I don't know. He's just a good player. I mean, he can play in a 4-3 front. He can play 3-4 inside, especially on passing downs. He can play 3 technique. Just can help you in a lot of ways. Pretty good hand usage and just tons of energy constantly on the attack. So just a couple. Austin Johnson didn't impress me as much as I hoped he would. Thought he would have a little bit better hand usage and be a little more explosive. Generated a good push consistently, but just didn't see him disengage and finish a lot, which is what you want to see with the guy you're taking in the first round, even if he's going to be maybe a 4-3 nose. So just a couple guys that impressed me there. I mean, the defensive line was very talented, and there were a lot of guys who stood out, I thought.
How many, I'm just sort of a little background question just so I know where to ask my follow-up question, but how many Senior Bowls had you gone to prior to this year?
This was actually the first one, so it was a great
so this was your first one. I'm curious, and when you were just watching the practices or were you watching the game, were there, I mean, you say so somewhat in your article, I think, and you kind of make it clear which guys really stood out, but I mean, just from a visual standpoint, when you were watching the game or when you were watching the practices, were there 1 or 2 players that just seemed like they did not belong with these guys? These guys were below their class. They do not, they just sort of run over all the rest of these guys, and that's how much better that you expect them at the next level to just be able to immediately catch up to the speed of the game. Were there guys that just stood out visually when you were watching the game as being faster, quicker, stronger than everybody else?
Yeah, there were a couple guys that I felt like didn't. I struggled to, justify their presence there a little bit. Austin Blythe from Iowa works really hard. but he's just undersized, and he doesn't win like Jack Allen can win despite being undersized. I mean, he doesn't have the same anchor, doesn't have the same technique. He tries to get his hands inside, but he really got beat up pretty good by some guys throughout the week. And so I thought he struggled. I thought Josh Forrest, the linebacker from Kentucky, I thought his tape was bad coming in. I was confused about his presence here and did not think he acquitted himself much better. He wasn't bad, but there were clear limitations with him, and I thought he struggled as a result. Quarterbacks wise, you're kind of you're up against it if you're trying to pick 8 quarterbacks for this year's draft. I'm not saying there was necessarily someone better that should have been there, but Cody Kessler really struggled in practices. Which was maybe to be expected. I thought Jacoby Brissett had one good drive in practices when they did a 2-minute drill, and everyone kind of used that to justify his performance throughout the week. But during the week, he was pretty rough in his performance. Really, none of the quarterbacks, and Carson Wentz wasn't even that great. He just looked great compared to the other ones. But those are some of the guys. I mean, Eric Murray, the cornerback from Minnesota, he flashed a little bit on the last day, but he just was mugging guys throughout the week. And without refs there, the coach has said a couple things to him, but I mean, he just not something that he's going to be able to get away with in the NFL. And he's too small to play that way anyway. If he's going to win that way, he's basically Brandon Brown or Byron Maxwell waiting to happen. And I thought that he did some nice things in terms of playing the pocket on the last day, but not a guy that I would say acquitted himself super well. And the last guy I'll say is Glenn Gronkowski just isn't ready. I mean, I know he wasn't getting used at Kansas State. I know he'd already graduated, and so I get why he's coming out, but it's hard for me to picture him being drafted. He's not athletic. His route tree needs a lot of development. I kid you not, he ran one route. I'm not even sure what it was, but he sprinted 10 yards off the ball, and the defensive back was waiting to open his hips and break on the route. And he just ran directly into the defensive back like it was a run blocking drill.
Mm-hmm. What
just
about the
no real clue how to get open? So,
what about the inverse? The 1 or 2 guys that really were a cut above everyone else.
I think Sterling Shepard, and everybody talked about Braxton Miller all week, but Sterling Shepard I thought was clearly the best wide receiver here, and I did not think it was close. Braxton did have some good moments, but he also had drops, and there were issues with his routes on a couple balls, and him and the quarterback not being on the same page. But if you threw to Sterling Shepard, he made the play. It was pretty much how it went all week. I mean, I remember the first day of practice, Coker threw one deep, and it was underthrown, and I think it was Taven Young maybe had pretty good coverage on the play, and Sterling Shepard just kind of flipped his hips and went down and kind of scooped the ball up off his back hip. Just a very aware play, just natural receiving instincts all over the place. I mean, people are going to knock him for his size, but somebody's going to get a great player probably in the second round, and teams are going to be ruined the mistake they made, just like they made with Tyler Lockett last year. Thought that Darian Thompson from Boise State established himself as a first-rounder. I mean, another guy, teams are like, how fast is he? He's 6'2", he's 215, he can hit, he can play in the box, he's got range on the back end, he reads routes and the quarterback's eyes extremely well, he's got range, he's got ball skills. He's very physical in run support, makes his fills extremely well. A guy that I just think can play in a number of spots. You can put him in single high. You can put him in cover 2. You can put him in a robber role. You can put him in the box if you want. And I think he's going to be fine in all those places. Studies the game, very much a student of the game, very vocal throughout practice on the back end, established himself as a leader, and played great in the game. So I thought he was fantastic. And Harlan Miller was a kid that surprised me a little bit. I didn't get to watch him as much as I would have liked, but when I did see him, I thought he was always around the ball, played really well, and is a guy who isn't that big, but I think can maybe play on the outside in the NFL. So I'll be curious to see what he runs and what his times look like, but I thought he acquitted himself pretty well as a cornerback here. Those are just a couple guys that I thought stood out. I mean, there were more for sure. There are some guys that I thought I wasn't sure what to expect, and some guys I really wanted to see more. Joshua Perry, the linebacker from Ohio State, I thought he could establish himself as a for sure second rounder, and he got hurt the first day of practice. So a little bit disappointed about that. A little bit disappointed about not seeing Leonte Carew out here. I thought he could establish himself as a second rounder with a good week, and so those guys got hurt early in the week and couldn't perform. But tons of talent out here, and for the most part, it looked like I think it was the best Senior Bowl group just from watching on TV in years past that they've had here.
I wonder, John, do you have any idea, or do you have sort of how do you estimate how fast Sterling Shepard is, having seen him at the Senior Bowl? You know, is he a guy who could run in the 4.4s? I think Tyler Lockett ran a 4.40 at the combine last year. Is he kind of in that range, or is he a little slower?
I think he's in that range. Yeah, maybe a tad slower. How much he's going to win vertically could be in question, but I think it's certainly enough to be able to win over the top and to be able to threaten the defense on the back end. Yeah, he's not a 4.3 guy, I don't think, but I wouldn't expect him to be much slower than maybe high 4.4s at the worst.
I want to talk a little bit about, as well as just the supposed now number one pick in the draft, Laramie Tunsil. It seems like it's coming down to that unless the Titans trade down. Not that exciting for a team with Taylor Lewan, to be drafting a tackle first overall. I just think because they have a pretty good left tackle. So they're basically drafting a right tackle, which has become sort of a trend, it seems like, in drafts that don't have, standout players. And I'm just kind of curious, what, in your opinion, with Laramie Tunsil, like, I'm looking at the last 3 drafts, and the top 10 tackle-type players are Eric Fisher, Luke Jokel, Lane Johnson, Greg Robinson, Jake Matthews, Brandon Scherf, and Eric Flowers. It's early to know for sure how some of these guys will turn out. Others are already clearly at least disappointments. Lane Johnson signs a huge contract, but I don't know what that means exactly because he's still playing right tackle. He's not Jason Peters. How does Laramie Tunsil stack up? Are we going to look at is it underwhelming? Or is Laramie Tunsil? I mean, it's not often that a Walter Jones comes around, but that's not what Laramie Tunsil is he?
I mean, I'm not going to compare any rookie to maybe one of the greatest offensive tackles, obviously, but I think that Tunsil is a generational talent. So take that for what you will. But I don't think any of those guys you mentioned before hold a candle to what he brings to the table. I think he has the ability to be that dominant of a player. I mean, a guy who missed most of the beginning half of the season and came in week 1 and had to face the best, or the first week he played, and had to face the best pass rusher maybe in college football, and Myles Garrett, and really shut him down. I mean, pretty much completely shut him down, and just an impressive performance. And it was like that all year. I mean, a rare athlete for the position. I mean, no question in my mind, if he had played tight end, he would be a top-tier tight end. I mean, that's just the kind of athleticism he brings to the table. Unbelievable length, unbelievable feet, his power. He's nasty in the run game. He commits himself to the game of football. So as long as he stays healthy, continues to develop and takes football seriously, which by all indications he does, you never use the word safe. Every pick comes with an element of risk, but I think that he's just one of the more sure things in this year's draft, and I think he's going to be a top-tier talent. And, if Tennessee takes him, I think they're putting him on the left side, and Taylor Lewan's moving to the right side. Not that he hasn't done a good job, he has, but that's the kind of ceiling Tunsil. And then at this point, there's really no difference. I mean, you just kind of putting a rookie in a spot that he feels more comfortable in, I think, rather than less comfortable. And, at this point, you have great pass rushers off the right and left side, so I'm not sure it matters much, but I just think that's how they'll use them. But, it's a tough spot if you're Tennessee. They could trade down. It wouldn't shock me at all if they tried to trade down. But you're getting the best offensive tackle I've ever scouted, I think. So I think, he brings that to the table.
What are your thoughts then on Sean Coleman? Because we've talked a lot about him on this podcast. That's been Rob's guy since I think about mid-season. That it's, I think that things change obviously, but Sean Coleman is a guy that we've been saying is going to get into the first round, maybe even top 15-ish, maybe once all the measurements are out there. And what are your thoughts on Sean Coleman?
I like Sean Coleman a lot too, so yeah, that's good. All the physical tools I think are there. He's just really he has a long way to go technically. He's a bit top heavy at times. He can play off balance. He has to establish that consistent punch timing. And that goes along with his feet. Are his feet in rhythm with his hands? A lot of the time, I think his feet aren't quite set and in position, and he's trying to punch and lunge out at guys. So he gets off balance and opens himself up for counters. But that stuff's fixable. And you look at drafts in the past couple of years. DJ Humphries last year was 23rd overall, 26 something like that overall pick, and he was a guy who's probably as raw, if not more raw, than Sean Coleman. But I loved Humphries because you just can't replicate what they can bring to the table. And Coleman is as tough, obviously, an individual with what he's been through with cancer as anyone. Just an incredible mindset, incredible work ethic that he brings to a team. And there's no doubt in my mind, I think that he'll end up being a very good player. I don't know how NFL teams will weigh that because, Arizona takes DJ Humphries last year in the first round. I'm sure there were some teams that had him as a second or third round prospect. So all that needs to be weighed appropriately, I think, and different teams will have him in different spots. He's a guy that, you say it only takes one. It only takes one team that could take him in the first round. I thought about him long and hard, actually, to Seattle when I was doing my mock draft because I've had him in the first round of my last couple. And it wouldn't shock me at all if he went in the back end of the first round. I think one of his biggest struggles is actually going to be that he has to compete kind of with Jason Spriggs, who obviously is at the Senior Bowl, gets to show scouts that he can develop and improve too. And they're similar in the fact that I think they bring all the physical traits to the table, but both players are pretty raw. And I think Coleman's a better run blocker, and Spriggs can be a better pass protector. But both have really high ceilings, but are going to need development and be able to take those steps before they're ready to play a full-time role, I think. So if Spriggs goes really high, then that could knock Coleman down a couple spots. But either way, I think his draft stock will be fine. And, if you end up in the back end of the first round, sometimes they always say that could be the best thing for you long term. So maybe you get to sit and you get to develop and you get some of the best coaching, obviously, in the game. So I think that could benefit Coleman even if he ends up there.
Rob, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on that.
Well, yeah, I think that Sean Coleman has got some similarities to Eric Flowers. I think the way that they play, their style, the intensity that they play with is pretty similar. And I don't think that many people kind of expected that Eric Flowers was going to end up being, I think he was the number 10 overall pick last year. So, I think there's a chance that Coleman might surprise people. It'd be very interesting to see how he measures, how teams view the whole age thing. And they're going to have to do a medical check on Sean just because of the cancer, which is, that you've got to expect that with teams. I just wondered, there was one guy I really wanted to ask John about, is while we're talking about offensive tackles, and if we're talking about, raw but with a lot of upside, there aren't many offensive linemen in college with nearly 36-inch arms that are, well above 300 pounds and have got sort of 6'5", 6'6" in height. And yet, whenever you watch LaRaven Clark of Texas Tech on tape, I think he's just got some of the worst tape you could possibly see. And then when you see him at the Senior Bowl, and he seemed to struggle for most of the week. What was your impression, John, of LaRaven Clark? And do you think that a team is going to be able to buy into sort of the upside of this guy and maybe take him in the middle rounds? Where do you see him sort of falling at the moment?
Yeah, he's going to be more than Coleman, more than Spriggs. He's going to be a guy who some teams have that they're like, we can take this guy in the mid rounds and we can develop him. We can teach him how to play NFL style. And some teams probably won't have him on their board at all. It's just the way that it is. I mean, someone reported, I can't remember, one of the draft guys one of my colleagues who reported recently that they had talked to scouts and they felt pretty strongly about the fact that Raven Clark's college tape is basically going to be thrown out, and teams are accepting the fact they're going to have to start from the ground up with him. There's a lot of physical traits there. How tough is he? How hard is he willing to work? Is he willing to grind and be physical and go through the rigors of getting yelled at and having to fix every aspect of his footwork? I mean, these guys that come from these spread systems, we've seen it, for years now, that they don't tend to do as well. A lot of it's due to really shallow pass sets, and they don't get enough depth in their kick slide, so they're leaving themselves susceptible to edge rushers, and then they try to overset, and they're leaving themselves open for counters, for inside rushes, for power moves. The Ravens, the good pass rushers this week just straight up took them apart. Noah Spence straight up took them apart. I mean, even guys like Bronson Calfusi, all these, they straight up took him apart because he just doesn't know what to do technically. There's tons of tools there, and there's flashes. You'll see one good rep, and that's it. But his hands aren't inside all the time. He gets top heavy. He's not a prospect that I love. I just think that they're very difficult to develop, those guys. And I'd have to be convinced that mentally and physically he's tough enough to be able to go through everything the coaches will put him through the first year or two, and then be a guy who you can plug in and play at a high level. I think that's pretty rare. I think that teams taking a big risk if they try and take LaRaven Clark anywhere before day 3. I just don't think he's ready. I would value him in the 5th round maybe or something like that. But there's a pretty big drop off after the top tier guys, I think, and so you've got a lot of developmental guys, so that could cause his stock to bump up a little bit. But I just think most teams will not want to deal with the headache.
I mean, I hope that if any team does, I hope that it's the Ravens. You got to put 2 and 2 together. How many teams can say that they have the player with the same name right in there, besides maybe the Bills? I don't know. I'm curious, what were your thoughts? Our first NFL draft prospect guest on this show was safety Miles Killebrew. We liked him as a potential guy to come in and maybe come into the Seahawks and play as a safety, maybe even a linebacker, and there were qualities that we really liked about him. I think at this point it seems obvious that Cam Chancellor probably will be coming back, and maybe the Seahawks have bigger needs. But what are your thoughts on Miles Killebrew?
Yeah, I wasn't crazy about Miles' tape, and so I really wanted to see him in Mobile, but I didn't feel like I got much more perspective on him when I was there. I thought that in the game he played pretty decently. But he tries to go for knockout shots, and he doesn't always wrap up, so he misses some tackles. I wonder. I don't really feel like I've got a great feel for what he'll run, probably because in that level of play, you look faster than everyone else, so I don't know how fast he'll really be. And that'll matter to teams. Not necessarily a ton to me unless it's terrible, but so I wonder how he'll match that speed again. But I think he's explosive moving north-south. Is he fluid enough to turn and kind of flip his hips? So I'll be watching those drills at the combine, seeing how he does those things. Definitely a good in-the-box presence who can play physical. If he learns to be a better tackler, more consistent tackler, I should say, then I think I value him a lot in that role. I wonder how much range he has on the back end sometimes. I don't think his ball skills are on Darian Thompson's level or even Kevin Byard's level. So I think I prefer those guys a little bit. But Killebrew's size, his physicality, I've heard he's a very vocal guy who takes leadership and works very hard at the game. Extremely well-spoken kid who conducts himself well. So I don't think he's as versatile as Darian Thompson, but I like him on the second day as a guy who can find a role with the team, who knows how to use him and probably work at his game until he's very good at that role and fill it well. So similar to the way that Cam Chancellor has mastered his role, I think, in Seattle, Miles Killebrew can master a role like that somewhere else. But I think his combine workouts will be big. I think how he matches up, because like I said, when you're watching tape and you're watching kind of those lower level guys, those lower level teams, play against each other, a guy looks faster than everyone else on tape, but he may not be that fast when compared with NFL talent. So I didn't feel like I got a great feel for that in practice, and he's probably the top guy. And I was telling one of my colleagues this, that I kind of wish I'd been able to see a little bit more of, but I really focused on O-line, D-line play a lot when I was there, so I didn't feel like I saw enough of Killebrew's reps to gain a ton more perspective on him, which I'm a little bit bummed about. But I think that I like his skill set, even if it's a little raw, enough that I would be willing to take him on the second day somewhere.
John Ledyard, USA Today, we want to thank you for all your time today, coming on and sharing your draft thoughts and Senior Bowl thoughts. Follow John on Twitter at Ledyard, Ledyard, NFL Draft. And much like his ancestors, I want you to explore draftwire.usatoday.com. Thank you so much for coming on, John.
Hey, thank you guys so much for having me. Been a blast, and look forward to continuing to talk the draft and talk prospects with you guys moving forward.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. And that's it for John. Rob, any overarching thoughts there?
No, it was very interesting. I didn't know about his ancestor, by the way, Kenny. That's some fantastic research that you did there. Before.
He was with, I believe, Captain Cook.
So that John was probably the coolest guy we've had on the podcast so far, purely for the backstory there. So
right. No offense to their past. I'm sure others have. I mean, Miles Killebrew could be related to Harmon Killebrew. I don't know.
Hey, maybe.
That's a baseball player. I don't know if you guys are aware of baseball players in the UK.
We tend to kind of stick towards cricket, which lasts even longer than baseball, and and kind of not much happens. It's pretty similar. But I thought he had some very interesting views, and it was great to get some insight from somebody who was in Mobile, who had an opportunity to see a lot of the drills. I think that a lot of what he was saying makes an awful lot of sense, Kenny. And I was fascinated as well because one of the prospects that I've really spent a lot of time watching this week is the Notre Dame center Nick Martin. And the more and more I watch of Nick Martin, the more impressed, the more convinced I am that he's going to go in the top 40 picks in the draft, that he has to be a candidate. He has to be a candidate for me to be an option for the Seahawks with a 26th overall pick. And when I hear John sort of saying, everything that he saw from Nick Martin in the week suggested that he was a really safe pick, at everything that you want to see. Won pretty much every battle that he had. I had an opportunity to watch the third day of practice at the Senior Bowl online, and I didn't see him lose a single snap the whole time while he was on the field, Nick Martin. And then watching the game as well, it was more of the same. I thought that he and Joe Dahl from Washington State sort of combined really well in the second half, Kenny. And I just had visions watching the second half of the Senior Bowl and imagining Joe Dahl playing right guard for Seattle and playing center. And that combination was just fantastic. And it was impossible not to sort of watch that. And I know that a lot of Seahawks fans are wondering whether J.R. Sweezy's going to re-sign or whether Mark Glowinski's going to get a chance to play right guard. But when I was watching Nick Martin and Joe Dahl, I was only thinking about those two guys playing for the Seahawks next year. And I think that Seattle, as they look to rebuild this offensive line, they look to get tough, they look to get consistency up front, they want to protect Russell Wilson and still be able to run the ball. I think that those are a couple of guys there for the interior that I would want to focus on an awful lot over the next few weeks.
I've been doing this podcast with you for nigh on 20-something weeks. I don't know. But also I've known your habits in the past. And I'm saying right now, from hearing you talk the way you talk about Nick Martin, I haven't heard you say these kinds of stuff with any of the other prospects. I'm starting to say that here we are, like 4 months away from the draft, less than that, 3 months or something away from the draft. I'm thinking you're locked in. You want Nick Martin.
I could certainly make a case. I mean, he's not the only guy. I wouldn't.
But you do tend to fall in love with a guy in the way that you did at Joel Bitonio. That you said, now this is a guy that I know is going to be good. He's not going to fail you. You just get him where you can. You can get, I like other guys for other positions later in the draft. And you're looking at Nick Martin at center, and you're saying this is the center for the next 10 years if you draft him.
Yeah, I think that whoever drafts Nick Martin is going to get a great player. And it's funny because I think that one of the problems that Nick Martin has got, Kenny, is that people have just assumed that he's not going to be an early round pick. And yet when they actually go and watch him, they can't find any holes in his game. So, but because the mindset is that Nick Martin's probably going to go in round 3 or whatever, that's where he's going to go ultimately. And I think if you actually just sit down and watch it and just sort of ignore any thought of what you have about Nick Martin or what his stock might have been a couple of months ago, and you just watch this guy, there was not a better offensive lineman at the Senior Bowl this week. There wasn't a better guy at any position. And that includes Jason Spriggs, and that includes Cody Whitehair, and that includes all of the offensive linemen that people talk about. Nick Martin was the best, and it wasn't even close. The guy doesn't get beat. If you want, the best thing you can do is go and find the best 2 or 3 games that a guy plays in a season and just go and hammer the tape. And I watched Notre Dame play Ohio State again this week, and I watched the game twice through. It's on Draft Breakdown. Anybody can go and watch it. And I don't think he, we're talking about he didn't lose a snap at the Senior Bowl. I don't think he lost a snap against Ohio State. So that was coming up against all of the talent that they have up front, all of the quality that they have at linebacker, that they were blitzing, they were trying to get to the Notre Dame quarterback. Notre Dame wanted to try and run the ball. Nick Martin was fantastic in that game. And I don't see any reason not to believe that he's going to be as good as his brother is. Now, Zach Martin's footwork was better. He was a bit more agile on his feet, and that is why he played left tackle for Notre Dame, and that's why he went 16th overall to the Dallas Cowboys. Nick Martin's footwork isn't going to make a jot of difference if he's playing center. You just eliminate that. You just remove that as an issue because he's playing center. He's not playing left tackle. He's not going to be playing left tackle like his brother may have ended up doing. So if you take away the footwork issue, I'm watching Zach Martin, and I watched him an awful lot, and believed that he was going to be a first-round pick long before a lot of other people did. Going into the season, his final season at Notre Dame, I had him as sort of a list of 20 guys that were going to go nailed on first rounders, and he looked like he was going to go in the first round. And I look at Nick Martin, and I don't see any difference between the two. And if you'd say to 32, every single one of the 32 NFL teams, would you like Zach Martin with your first round pick this year? I think the most of them would say yes.
I mean, it's an interesting thing if they take a center. In the entire history of the Seahawks franchise, they have drafted more centers in the top 44 picks than they have drafted wide receivers. And I was looking at this today because I was like, what are the wide receivers they've taken in the first round and whatnot? And I looked at all the wide receivers. In the top 40, they took Paul Richardson 45th overall. So that's the third highest that they've ever drafted a wide receiver. The only other two are Corn Robinson and Joey Galloway. They went 8th and 9th. And other than that, they never had them wide receivers. But centers, they've taken 3 in the top 35 or something. You've got Kevin Mawai and Chris Spencer and then someone else. But it's interesting, though, when you talk about interior linemen and ones that get drafted earlier. In the last 3 years, 14 tackles have gone in the first round. I named a lot of them earlier when we were talking to John. 14 tackles. None of them have made the Pro Bowl. Not a single one. And I know that the Pro Bowl, we watched it. If anybody watched it on Sunday, I didn't. But if you noted who was there, you know that maybe it's not the most prestigious thing. That's mostly pertains these days to quarterbacks who can't risk injury. The quarterback class in Pro Bowls are awful. Talking about some of the most average, below average players in the NFL that can go to the Pro Bowl. But tackles and guards and centers, these are usually the top guys, and they don't get a lot of the notability and $100 million contracts. So you're going to get some of the best guys to go there. Tackles in the last 3 years, not a single one. You talk about the most standout players. You talk about Taylor Lewan or maybe Jawan James. It's not that exciting when you talk about the tackles. Now in the last 3 years, how many? You've got 5 guards that have been drafted in the first round. 2 of them have made multiple Pro Bowls. Kyle Long has been to a Pro Bowl every single year in his 3 years. Zach Martin, who we've been talking about, 2 Pro Bowls and 1 All-Pro nod. First team All-Pro. The others, Laken Tomlinson, I think was one of the best guards in the NFL this year for the Detroit Lions. And then you've got the 2 guys that have sort of struggled, Chance Warmack and Jonathan Cooper. There's injuries involved there. Chance Warmack, I'm not exactly sure. What are your thoughts on Chance Warmack after 3 years?
I don't think he's lived up to expectations, and he was so fantastic for Alabama. It's a bit of a surprise. I mean, he went in the top 10 with Jonathan Cooper, who has likewise not been anywhere near as good as anybody expected. But it's interesting that you mentioned some of the names there, Kenny. I mean, the one thing that the Seahawks have generally gone for.
Let me at least then we'll just throw in the other thing, which is 2 centers have gone in the first round. One of them, Travis Frederick, is probably one of the top 2-3 centers in the NFL. And then the other one, Cam Irving, he's had 1 rookie year with the Browns, sort of a weird pick, but high percentage hits if the Seahawks do decide to take a guard or a center.
Yeah. And, I look at this, and the Seahawks have generally taken high upside players who they feel like they can coach up. So whether it's Bruce Irvin, whether it's Christian Michael, Paul Richardson, players like that, it's guys that you don't generally look at as sort of high picks, but they feel like they've got this limitless talent they can coach up. And yeah, I listened to sort of Pete Carroll and John Schneider about what they're talking about in terms of their needs and the need for consistency up front and the need to be physical and wanting to be the bully and wanting to, sort of turn over a new leaf maybe with the way that they've approached the offensive line. I just think more than anything, if you just nail if you're going to spend the first round pick, go and get someone who can start straight away and is going to do you a job. Now, the Seahawks mucked around with the center position last year. They, when they traded Max Unger, they didn't get Wisniewski, went to Jacksonville. Evan Mathis could have come in and maybe played center. They didn't get him. So what do? They played Drew Nowak and struggled for the first 6 weeks of the season, and then eventually turned to the guy who they thought Drew Nowak was better than, and that's Patrick Lewis. They can't afford to be doing that next year. They need to know who their center is going to be in week 1, at the very beginning of training camp. And if you bring Nick Martin in, that you're going to play him there, and he's going to give you a chance to stop Aaron Donald. He's not going to be able to do it completely. No one's going to shut down Aaron Donald, but he gives you a chance to do it. Same when he comes up against Kawan Short and Starlu Talele when they're playing Carolina. He's going to give you a chance. And you can build around him. Now, there are athletic offensive tackles. You know, if the Seahawks can still do the whole development thing. I mean, we talked about LaRaven Clark. LaRaven Clark has everything that you would want in terms of length, size, mobility, agility that you would want in a NFL left tackle. But he is as raw as it comes, Kenny. You know, the technique is hopeless. The system that he plays in at Texas Tech it puts him on an island almost and asks him to sort of cover the inside, but also watch the edge, which is very, very difficult to do. They're so spread out, the offensive line, and it's very difficult to sort of coach someone in that scheme. Now, if the Seahawks are prepared to take a defensive lineman and say, we're going to try and coach you up from scratch, would they consider taking LaRaven Clark in round 3 or round 4 and saying that's going to be our right tackle this year or that's going to be our left tackle? Well, why wouldn't they do that? You know, they were prepared to start Gary Gilliam at right tackle. You know, the idea that the Seahawks need to take a left or right tackle in the first round as opposed to a center, for example, I don't buy into that. Now, they could go tackle first and wait. It's a very deep center class. You know, there's some other options there. But if you want someone who's going to start week 1 and you know what you're going to get from that guy, and it's going to be tough, physicality, great pass protection, the ability to open holes in the running game, tremendous consistency, you know, not having to worry about that position for the next 5 years at the very least, hopefully the next decade, then I would think that Nick Martin would be a really smart pick for the Seahawks. They've generally made smart picks under John Schneider and Pete Carroll. So I'm just going to suggest that the more people watch of this guy, the more likely they're going to come around and realize that this guy is not a mid-round pick. He's a first-round pick.
As far as pure tackles go, guys that'll definitely play on the, that could play on the left side or definitely would be on the right side. If we're looking for the Seahawks to continue to search in the mid rounds, I'm curious because I'm looking at all of the tackles drafted in the last 3 years. I mentioned that no first rounders have made the Pro Bowl. None of them in any of the rounds have made the Pro Bowl. Maybe it's just going to take a little bit longer. I'm sure some of these guys will. Perhaps the best tackle drafted in the last 3 years is the Packers' David Bakhtiari, who was the 4th round pick, 109th overall out of Colorado. Question A, what did you think of David Bakhtiari in the draft? Does it surprise you to see him have success? And B, do you see a David Bakhtiari in this draft?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, this is a really good draft for me to consider drafting somebody in that range. A developmental tackle or somebody who can come in and even if they don't start straight away, potentially develop and work with them. We know that they've liked to take these guys and use Tom Cable to try and work them up. With Bakhtiari, from what I remember about him in the draft, and I don't remember that much, I remember thinking that because of his size, he'd probably end up at guard because he's not, a big, long, typical offensive tackle. He was at Colorado, so he wasn't sort of on the radar as somebody that you watched an awful lot. So I'm pretty surprised that he's had the success that he's had. But there are a lot of guys here. I mean, LaRaven Clark is somebody who people are going to hate because the tape's awful and he's had a horrible week at the Senior Bowl. But someone's going to take a chance on him. It could easily be the Seahawks. It could easily be in that sort of round 3, round 4 range. And you could end up getting a really good pick if he can if the light switches on, if he is responsive to coaching. That's going to be the big challenge for teams like the Seahawks is to find out whether these guys are receptive to coaching. And we'll find that out about LaRaven Clark when they get to the combine. There's another guy who, we've been talking about Laramie Tunsil a lot today, Kenny. Well, Laramie Tunsil did not play the first, 6, 7, 8 games of the season at Ole Miss. And there was a guy called Fawn Cooper who played instead. And he was originally at Bowling Green. He decided after a year or 2 at Bowling Green that he wanted to try and join, a major conference, major team, major conference. So he went to the JUCO ranks, did a year there. Ole Miss recruited him after that. And he's played left and right tackle for Ole Miss for the last 2 seasons. And he has been, when I put the tape on, I couldn't believe that this guy was being rated as a 6th round pick. I mean, he took to the left tackle position perfectly. And on the right tackle position, he can play both of those roles. If the Seahawks want somebody who might be available on the 3rd day, who could potentially start for them at tackle next year, keep an eye on Fawn Cooper. And he is a really, really smart guy. it's important to watch interviews and listen to these people talk, to see if they've got sort of real instinctive football knowledge. Are they talking about schemes? Are they talking about their roles? Are they not just grunting back at the journalists? These are all things that I think are important. And Fawn Cooper was one of the most well-spoken offensive tackles I've ever heard. So, and very knowledgeable about the game. So if people want to maybe a sleeper pick on day 3 who could come in and play tackle, who could be a David Bakhtiari type, then keep an eye on Fawn Cooper at Ole Miss.
Speaking of knowledge, I am kind of curious because I'm looking over some of the other centers and guards that have gone recently. There's definitely value to be had at the other positions, guard, center. You can find some of these guys. Obviously, center. You've got guys like Corey Linsley and Brian Stork and Russell Bodine that have been drafted in recent years. Ali Marpet. I don't know if he played center this year, but I'm kind of curious. One of the guys was John Urschel, who obviously is quite notable for his intelligence and his mathematics skills, and going for his, I think, PhD in the offseason. Are there any guys that you expect to come in and crush that Wonderlic test this year? Any possible 50 guys? Anyone coming from the Ivy League?
Not from. I mean, I've not studied the guys from the Ivy League. I think there's an offensive tackle called, is it Carl Toner? Who I think is from Harvard. And he was actually at the Senior Bowl, I think. I'm going to try and it's Cole Toner of Harvard. So he was actually at the Senior Bowl.
Okay.
So I mean, I've not actually sort of studied much on his game. I couldn't tell you a great deal about him. But if we're looking for a potential genius within the ranks of the 2016 draft class, maybe Cole Toner would be the guy to keep an eye on there.
I mean, not bad. NFLDraftScout.com has Cole Toner as the number 14 rated offensive tackle, 6'5", 305 pounds for Harvard. Obviously, these ratings will wildly differ. How do you feel? We never really got into some of the other draft websites, and I know that the ones that always show up on the front page of Google when you look for prospects. How do you feel about NFLDraftScout.com? What are some of the places that you do go to for the most accurate measurables and that kind of stuff?
Well, it's funny because I don't want to get in the business of sort of criticizing other people. I mean, there are a lot of other websites that I think there's a slight issue in that they will put out a generic ranking. Maybe they'll scout somebody when they're a junior or maybe even as a sophomore, and then the ratings or the rankings or the scouting report doesn't really change. And then by the time you get to sort of the draft time, a lot of these rankings are outdated. I think the one that I really trust, Tony Pauline, who is at draftinsider.net. I just think that apart from the fact that he is a very entertaining guy, and having had the opportunity to talk about the draft with him, I mean, he's always got big opinions and he says very interesting things. I find that his sort of eye for scouting is pretty good. He's done it for a long time. He's very passionate about the NFL draft. And he also is a terrific insider. So nobody seems to get more little bits of information than Tony Pauline. And actually over the years, he's had quite a few nuggets about the Seahawks. So he said about this time last year that they were very interested in Terry Poole, who they drafted eventually in round 4 of the 2015 draft. He said in the past, before Aaron Donald became Aaron Donald's surefire top 15 pick, he said that the Seahawks were very interested in Aaron Donald. This is when people were wondering whether Aaron Donald would be too small to go in the first round, and that the Seahawks may take him at the end of the first. When people were wondering whether Odell Beckham was big enough to go in the top 15 picks or whether he was even very good, Tony was saying the Seahawks loved him in the first round. So what sort of following Tony has made me realize is, one, the Seahawks are pretty clever and pretty intelligent at sort of identifying who are the special players in a draft class. But it's also, he knows, he understands sort of, he's got a couple of good sources within the Seahawks. And this week, Kenny, he put out that the Seahawks had a first round grade on Sheldon Rankins. So you can pretty much take that to the bank, that if Sheldon Rankins is available at around the 26th overall pick, then there's a chance he's going to be taken. But I'll also say this, if the Seahawks in January think that he's a first-round pick, he's probably going to go in the top 15, because that is generally what happens when they get linked with somebody like they had with Aaron Donald and with Odell Beckham.
I mean, I can't wait to see what all the speculation, what happens over the next few months. It's April 28th is the draft. I guess I should have just known that by now. This is a mock draft podcast, but April 28th, first round of the draft. So many things will happen between now and then. Less than 3 months to go, and how the Seahawks picks will go. I mean, I'm saying right now on February 1st, I'm predicting that Rob's pick is going to be Nick Martin, center out of Notre Dame for the Seahawks when he most posts his final mock draft. You have that on the record, Rob. I could hear it in your voice. I believe that you will ultimately you'll toy with some other things, but you'll just keep coming back to Nick Martin because you see Zach Martin and you know how successful he is. You know that the Seahawks, you know how important it is to have an important center. You know that last year, the Patriots won the Super Bowl with the rookie Brian Stork. Did you see that stuff today coming out about how Brian Stork was tipping the snap count?
No, I didn't. What's the story there?
Inside the Pylon published something about they could show through the clips against the Denver Broncos that by the second half, Denver had realized that just as Brian Stork was going to snap the football, he snapped his head up. So he looked down and then he snapped his head up. And DeMarcus Ware and Von Miller, two guys that you don't want to give any advantage to, had clearly from the first half to the second half started going at the snap of his head, not the snap of the football. And where he was tipping the snap count, which is why Tom Brady had the most pass rush game of his life, 20 knockdowns on Tom Brady. They had shown Stork in the previous games leading up to this that he wasn't snapping his head. For I don't know what, that he had that problem, I think, maybe a year or two ago, where they had shown it in a game against, I think, the Chiefs, where he was tipping the snap count, and then that was another bad game for them. He hadn't been doing it, but then if you watch the tape where they had shown these clips, Brian Stork was apparently part of the problem and part of the reason that the Broncos were able to put so much pressure on Tom Brady.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by this, and it's actually something that I don't think gets talked about enough. That good center play in the NFL, kind of because of people like Brian Stork, and because there was kind of like a spate of maybe sort of 1 or 2 years where teams were finding starting centers in the fourth round. So everybody kind of felt that they could do that or they could get by, and maybe that's what gave the Seahawks the kind of confidence to go with Drew Nowak. But we're talking about Brian Stork and what he was doing there. One of the things I noticed when watching back the Carolina Seahawks game in the divisional round was that I think it was J.R. Sweezy or Justin Britt was having to give a signal. I can't remember which one it was. One of the guards was looking back at Russell Wilson. He was getting the signal. He was tapping Patrick Lewis on the side, and then Patrick Lewis was snapping the ball. Now, if you're Kawan Short and you're seeing the guard tapping the center on his backside, and then that the ball's going to be snapped in 1 or 2 seconds, that it's going to help you just as much as Brian Stork shaking his head every time he's going to snap the ball. So it's not a great surprise that the Seahawks had just as much difficulty, or almost as much difficulty as the Patriots protecting their quarterback. And it is an important position. The Seahawks, when they're faced with a glaring problem, they generally go after it aggressively. So whatever it's been, and when Pete Carroll's laid out what they're going to do in his first after the first year he was here, he said they were the worst team running the ball in the league. So that has to improve. They went out and sort of built their off season around improving that. When ahead of the 2012 season, they said they wanted speed in the front seven. So they go and draft Bruce Irvin and Bobby Wagner. When they've said they're going to do something, they go and generally do it. I would be very surprised, watching more and more of the Seahawks, that their issue wasn't really protection off the edge. A lot of teams, Kenny, and everybody can see this. A lot of teams don't rush the Seahawks off the edge. They will just contain, because they know that if they can rush the interior, Russell Wilson has to scramble out, and generally he will run straight into the defensive ends who are not rushing the passer. They're kind of just containing, waiting for the quarterback to scramble. So if Seattle can protect the interior, knowing that the defensive ends are not going all out to beat the tackles, and if they can actually protect the interior, Russell Wilson is going to have a fantastic pocket most weeks. So the priority for me is find someone who can play tackle if you lose Russell Okung, and rebuild your interior line. Probably, if you can't keep J.R. Sweezy, then you're going to probably have to bring in 3 guys to play in the interior. You're going to have to find a big guy to play left guard. You're going to have to find a center, and you're going to have to find a right guard if it's not Glowinski. And this is the perfect draft for me to go and nail those needs. And the two guys that I would want to, the more I watch, the two guys I would want to come out of this class with are Nick Martin and Joe Dahl, who is the guard, the tackle at Washington State. I would want those two guys. And if I wanted any of the tackles, it would be Sean Coleman. But I think that Nick Martin and Joe Dahl, you can start to rebuild that interior line with those two guys.
I mean, I think you got some of, it's definitely some of the best. I mean, you look at the Carolina Panthers, Ryan Khalil, one of the best centers in the NFL. Potentially a Hall of Famer if he plays long enough. I'm not sure. But there's something to be said, I think, about top center play. I know that, we've talked about Max Unger potentially being a free agent again.
Just sorry to interrupt you, but you make a great point about Ryan Khalil. So what is the strength of Carolina's offensive line? Is it Michael Oher, who they brought in off the street to play tackle? Is it Mike Remmers, who was playing right tackle for Carolina? Or was it Ryan Khalil, the center, and Try Turner, the right guard? The two best offensive linemen on Carolina's team was the center and the right guard. If the Seahawks is a copycat league, copy the Panthers. Go and get yourself a fantastic center. Go and find yourself a guard that can work alongside him. I saw everything I needed to see at the Senior Bowl.
You got J.R. Sweezy in the 7th round. You got, 2.5 seasons out of him. There's no reason to say that you don't need to. I think that he's done a good of a job, better of a job. I think because he was switched from a different side of the field to offense. I think because he was a 7th round pick, and I think because he managed to remain a starter for 2 years, I think people are a little bit starting to overvalue how good he was. This was a player that has overcome long odds to get to this point, but he's certainly not the type of guy that I think you need to panic about dumping $4 to $5 million a year in for a few years. This is something that I think can be replicated through the means of finding another guy that costs $800,000 a year. I'm reading this book. It's I left it at a friend's house. It's supposedly written by an anonymous current NFL player. I don't know that much about the background of this book. It just had come out in January, but it was supposedly written by an offensive lineman who remains anonymous, and he plays guard or something. He said he plays guard, and in his talk about the way that he talks about, there's a lot of insight into the offensive line and the hierarchy of the offensive line and practices and all that kind of stuff, and politics and everything. But he does signal that it's the center that is the captain of the offensive line. The center controls everything. The left tackle is the most important from a physical standpoint. The left tackle is the hardest one to replace if you don't have a great one. And, that's the guy that's going up against typically the best pass rushers. Well, though now that's why teams need to have a good right tackle, because most teams now have two great pass rushers. But that's the guy. The tackles are the hardest to maybe find from a physical standpoint, but the center is still the guy to be the captain. He's got to be the guy that, can control the other 5 guys. He's making the calls. He's making the signals. So if you can't find a center on the low value spectrum, if you can't find a guy in the 3rd or 4th or 5th round to be your starter and to be control of all that kind of stuff, then sometimes you do have to go out and find a Nick Mangold, who was drafted, 29th overall. Ryan Khalil was 59th overall. Marquise Pouncey 16th overall. Alex Mack 21st. Travis Frederick 31st. Max Unger 49th. I mean, they're all pretty much in that 1st and 2nd round. So for the Seahawks to draft a center, I mean, it didn't really work out with Chris Spencer, though. It did work out, with the other guy that I mentioned earlier, who didn't really play for the Seahawks long enough. I can't remember his name, but he was a great center. Now I can't remember his name.
It's the guy went to Tennessee, isn't it?
Yeah.
Begins with W, M, doesn't it? Kevin
Mawai.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, he was a great player. Not really for the Seahawks, but he was a great player. And I think that, you should to get a center at this point, knowing what we saw from, Patrick Lewis, who,
I think you could argue that the center this year cost the Seahawks 2 games at the minimum. I think you could argue that pretty well, that poor center play may have been their downfall. Max Unger is going to be too expensive for the Saints, perhaps. I don't know if he's going to be too expensive for the Seahawks. I think Max Unger got a little overrated at times in Seattle, just because we didn't when he was in here 2009, 2010, 2011, those 3 years that he was here to begin with, there weren't a lot of good players on the team, so he really stood out. But center guard, this is probably going to be an area of need. They drafted, the 3 offensive linemen in the middle rounds last year. I don't think that we can really expect anything out of Terry Poole. Later on, when they took Christian Sicoli, we don't know what's going to happen to him, but he did stay on the team for the whole year. There are a lot of guys out there, but we're not necessarily. I mean, Rob, we're not really leaning towards them necessarily needing to keep. They might have to replace 4 offensive linemen this year. Would you say?
I think that it's very likely. Because Davis Hugh, who did some great work for field goals on so the cap and how much free money the Seahawks will have, he kind of calculated that for the 7 unrestricted free agents that I think you've had him on the podcast recently, haven't you, to talk about this?
Yeah, we own the field goals. Last Thursday we had Davis Sue, if you want to check that out.
So I mean, you're better off listening to what he had to say as opposed to, I'll just sort of give you the Cliff Notes version, but basically for the unrestricted free agents that Seattle had that are probably going to earn more than $2 million average per year, there were 7 of those guys. And he calculated that they would probably have about $18 million to try and keep those 7 guys. And that 7 includes Russell Okung and Bruce Irvin and J.R. Sweezy, Jeremy Lane, Jermaine Kearse, and the 2 defensive tackles. So, that's not a great deal of money to try and keep those guys. So if you were going to give, Russell Okung, there's talk that he might sign a 1-year deal for $5 million, which is fine. It's cheap, but then you've only got $13 million to sign the other 6. J.R. Sweezy is probably going to get in the range of $3 to $5 million average. All of a sudden, if you re-sign those 2 guys, you've not got a great deal left to do any of the other deals. I just get the feeling that looking at this draft class, it's going to be easier to rebuild the offensive line, which is kind of an improvement they need to make anyway, and then try and keep Jeremy Lane and try and keep your defensive tackles and try and keep, the bulk of the group together and just sacrifice the offensive linemen. Now, the problem is the Seahawks, like we mentioned, they need a captain. They need security at center. They can't get by at center. You were right, Kenny, when you said that it cost them at least a couple of games to start the season. And they need to know who their 5 guys are at the very latest, 3 weeks into training camp. So they need to know this, have a competition by all means, but these are our 5 guys. And they need to feel very confident that those 5 guys are still going to be there at the end of the season as well, health permitting. And if they lose Sweezy and they lose Okung, people are automatically going to say, well, the most important thing is to get a tackle in. And I just don't agree with that for all the reasons we've talked about. Just look at the Carolina Panthers, who run the ball, who protect their quarterback. And it's all geared around the sheer brilliance of Khalil, the center, and Try Turner, the right guard. And that is where the Seahawks should be starting for me to rebuild their line. Left guard, center, right guard. Make the improvements there. Move Gary Gilliam to left tackle if you want. Find a solution at right tackle. Whether it's a veteran like Phil Lodeholt, who's probably going to get released by Minnesota. Darrell Bevel's worked with him before. Whether it's someone like LaRaven Clark, who you feel you can work with over a training camp. Whether it is someone like Fawn Cooper, who you believe can kind of fill in as a tackle for you and do a job there. The most important thing is to protect that interior against the likes of Kawan Short and Aaron Donald and the Arizona guys as well. Knowing that teams are not necessarily going to try and rush you off the edge. And if they are, well, good luck, because the one thing Gary Gilliam can do off the edge is guard against speed. He's not a great, powerful offensive tackle. He's not technically brilliant, but he guards against speed really well. So if you want to beat us with a speed rush, then go ahead, because we've got the guys who can deal with that. What we don't have in Seattle are the guys who can protect against elite get-off, quickness, power, strength, swim, rip, move, and everything else that Aaron Donald brings to the table, and that has what the Seahawks don't try and do predominantly in the draft. There's some other options. They may go pass rusher in the first round and then rebuild offensive line. That's fine. But I think for the most part, they're going to focus on rebuilding that interior offensive line.
I want to finish up talking about the Super Bowl. I mean, that's what we do this all for, right? I mean, we spend 364 days a year as a fans, or as the teams do, just trying to get to the one day where you can win the Super Bowl. The Seahawks didn't make it there this year, which is why we're talking about the draft, which is fine. That's what we're going to talk about for the next 3 months. But it is a Super Bowl. That is the big deal. And the Panthers and the Broncos, they're coming up. We won't have another show before that game is played. So this Sunday, Panthers, Broncos. Surprisingly, I'm on NFLPickWatch.com to see. These are early, obviously. Not everyone's going to get their picks in until later in the week. But so far, surprisingly, it seems like Denver is the consensus pick over Carolina, 55%. Now, that's a lot of people being left out. Some people, it could be – it's just interesting because you've got Jason LaCanfora picks the Panthers. 538 says that it's going to be Denver. Will Brinson picks the Panthers. A little bit of bias there. Brinson is a Panthers fan, but I don't blame him for that. ESPN's best QB says it's going to be Carolina, but then if you go to PickWatch's best defense, it goes to the Denver Broncos. Pete Prisco picking the Denver Broncos, which makes me more apprehensive about my pick if it is the Denver Broncos. But Rob, where are you leaning towards right now? Broncos, Panthers. This is your opportunity to make your Super Bowl pick.
Okay, so I have spent a little bit of time thinking about this. I'm going to go with the Panthers. I just feel like they are the more complete team. Now, they have some holes. The secondary is not great, Josh Norman aside. They don't have, they've played without, if you can take Greg Olsen away, I don't think that Ted Ginn is going to have a great deal of success against this particular defense. And I think they'll do a much better job of getting to Cam Newton than the Seahawks or the Cardinals did in Carolina's last two games. But I just think that, I just got a feeling that the Panthers will score points. And if it's a game where it's going to be sort of like a 27-23 or something like that, I wonder whether or not Peyton Manning can do enough to keep up, because Peyton Manning just does not look like the Peyton Manning of old. He looks like old Peyton Manning. So I'm not entirely convinced that he's going to be able to keep up in a shootout. I could see a situation where maybe Carolina goes ahead quite early in the game like they did against Seattle and Arizona, and there's a bit of a fight back from Denver, but I can't see Manning sort of completing the full comeback. And I do like the Denver defense, and I would kind of like to see Peyton Manning finish his career in style. It would be kind of interesting to see Denver beat Carolina because, of course, they couldn't beat the Seahawks, and that, I don't know, there'd be a part of me that would enjoy seeing that. But at the same time, part of me wonders if Carolina and Cam Newton in particular, if they win a Super Bowl, will they kind of lose their hunger for next year? And maybe that'll be an advantage to the Seahawks. So
Yeah,
I'm going to go Carolina 27, Denver 23.
it's tough for me. I mean, I'm just struggling. I think that, and I don't think it has anything to do with any supposed rivalry that I have with the Carolina Panthers. I mean, I'm trying to be just totally unbiased. I'm just looking at it from a perspective that I'm really, what I'm struggling with is I think that nobody is really respecting Denver's defense as potentially one of the best of the century. I mean, I don't know if I'm ready to go all time, but as far as the last 15 years go, I think that the Denver Broncos have perhaps one of the top 5 or 10 defenses that we've seen. I think the 2013 Seahawks are up there, but I think that it's right there with the 2000 Ravens and the 2002 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I wonder if people felt the way they do about those defenses that they did going into the Super Bowl. I don't think that a lot of people really realized how good the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense was until it went into the Super Bowl against the number one offense with the Oakland Raiders and just dominated Rich Gannon, who threw 5 interceptions. 3 of them returned for touchdowns. I know that a lot of people were like, I can't believe how the Baltimore Ravens are here with this terrible offense. And the Baltimore Ravens had a worse offense in 2000 that the Broncos do now, because at least, Peyton Manning has the mind of Peyton Manning and not the body and mind of Trent Dilfer. So I think that you could argue that the offense here with Denver is better. And I think you could argue that the defense is, almost pretty much there on par. I think Von Miller and DeMarcus Ware, those are 2 Hall of Fame talents. I think Aqib Talib and Chris Harris are 2 of the best corners in the NFL. You look at the depth that they have at defensive end with Derek Wolfe and Malik Jackson. You look at Danny Trevathan and Brandon Marshall. I mean, these guys are going to go get major contracts and be, I think really big star linebackers. TJ Ward at safety, Raheem Moore. There's so many good players on this Denver defense, and that's why I think that it's going to be close. Now, the real struggle is, can the Carolina Panthers do enough on their defense to maybe sort of, they're going to need, I think, some of these Luke Kuechly pick sixes. They're just going to need a big play from their defense. And I don't know that Peyton Manning, as much as he's struggled this year, throwing all the interceptions, I think that he's in a place now where he's really started to maybe adjust to the type of quarterback that he is now. And he's not going to be trying to make Peyton Manning throws. And I think it's going to be a really close game. I wrote for Sports on Earth today. You can check it out on sportsonearth.com. 50 Super Bowl facts about all 50 Super Bowls. And it forced me to go back and review every single Super Bowl that there's been. And I think what a lot of people would be maybe surprised by, but in hindsight, is how often these games are really tight, if not the loser leading at halftime. So I think at halftime, I think it's going to be really tight. It could be very low scoring, maybe like a 10-7 type score at half. Maybe something happens in the end for one of these teams to pull away, because we've had Super Bowls where teams pulled away in the last 5 minutes just because of, teams are trying to do too much on offense to come back. You get a pick 6 or return 6. And all that being said, it's really tough for me to pick the team that has the worst quarterback, but at the same time, it's really tough for me to pick against the best defense. And that's what I'm struggling with. And I think at the end of the day, I gotta say, I just think maybe this is the one that goes in Denver's favor.
I could tell you were really battling with that, Kenny. There was some serious thought going on there.
And until the last words comes out, I mean, I was having both teams flash in my head as the word to say. I'm going to say Denver 21, Carolina 20 on a field goal by Brandon McManus. That's what I'll say. It'll be 21-20. I can't see the Carolina Panthers scored all the touchdowns. I mean, I don't care how many touchdowns they scored. I don't care if they put up a bunch of points against the Seahawks. I don't care if they did it against the Cardinals. The Broncos defense is playing better than both of those defenses playing right now. And I think that I've seen it in the past where teams put up all these touchdowns. You look at the 2013 Super Bowl between the Seahawks and the Broncos. Nobody said that you could stop the best offense of all time. At the end of the day, the best offense is no match for the best defense. So, and I don't even think the Panthers have a top 5 offense. I mean, I think it's just been completely blown out of proportion. The points are way overrated as far as how many of those points came from their defense. I don't think that I think Cam Newton has played much better quarterback recently. But when at the whole package, it's not the best offense in the NFL. It's not top 5. I would take the Seahawks offense over the Panthers offense. And that's another reason why I just think that the Panthers are going to have a hard time scoring more than 20 points. So they don't score 20, they lose. I'm going to say 21-20. Have I made any good points, Rob?
Yeah, of course, Kenny. It's a really respectable view, and I could definitely see it playing out exactly like you say. I think the key for Denver is exactly that. It's maybe to get a score on defense. Can Denver, when the Seahawks destroyed Denver in the Super Bowl, the defense put 2 points on the board with the first snap of the game. They had the turnovers which led to points. They had the Malcolm Smith pick 6. That's a lot of cheap points and kind of like it kind of avalanched down and smothered Denver. Can they do that to Carolina? Can Von Miller get a sack fumble in the first quarter, which maybe leads to a touchdown? Can they get an interception and get some field position, which leads to a score? Can they do the little things like that? Can they get a special team score or flip the field position a few times? That is going to be the crucial thing. And if you look at Carolina, they've won 2 playoff games in exactly the same style, getting out on top quickly and then clinging on. And I know that against Arizona, the clinging on bit kind of lasted a little bit and then they kind of pulled away again because Arizona is not very good. We found that out in sort of the last 3 games that they played. But it's if you can sort of quieten down the Panthers and get a lead and then put your defense in the position to try and win you the game, then there's every chance that Denver could do that. Denver have essentially got to try and make it exactly the same type of game as the AFC Championship, and Carolina's got to try and make it like the 2 NFC playoff games they played.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a good game for sure. It could go anyway. I mean, it's definitely weird if Peyton Manning throws 4 or 5 interceptions. Of course, it won't be a good game. If there's a higher likelihood that the Carolina Panthers blow this out than it is the Denver Broncos win by more than a touchdown. But I will say that I do feel that Denver will come away. I think it's a great ending for Peyton Manning's career, though I won't try and I don't want to make it more than what it is. I don't want to say that there's any magic going on. It would definitely be the right way for Peyton Manning to go out. I think it's weird that, that here we are now. It's funny because it's John Elway's the GM, so he's going to get a ring. So he'll always have one more ring than Peyton Manning, no matter what. Even if they win, then he'll get his 3rd, and Peyton Manning will get his 2nd. John Elway, the job that he's done as GM, maybe that's the most unbelievable. The 2 years that they've done to turn around since losing to the Seahawks in the Super Bowl, the way they've built that defense in 2 years. I mean, I don't know if there's any more incredible story of a guy going from, as a GM, just that how does it happen? How I can't imagine someday you telling me that Tom Brady is going to be the GM of the Patriots and lead them to, 2 Super Bowls in 3 years and possibly a championship. It's odd that we're talking about John Elway as a GM, but he's done a phenomenal job. And we talk about the draft. I mean, they've done some good stuff in the draft. They've obviously done possibly the best job on the free agent market with Ware and Talib and getting some of these guys. Do you have any thoughts real quick on the job that John Elway and the Denver Broncos have done in the last 2 years to rebuild and to come into the Super Bowl as a completely different team than the one that faced the Seahawks?
Sure. I mean, he's done a terrific job and kudos to him. And he's kind of changed the identity of that team to do what they had to do, which was essentially to be the Seahawks, which was to have a fantastic defense and an offense that was based around the running game, a lot of play action, and they could win off that. But, while we're talking, I cannot get the image out of my head now of Tom Brady as a GM, sort of notifying the players who have made the cut during training camp by leaving Ugg boots in their locker room. So like, got a pair of Uggs, you're in the 53.
Yeah, he's just an awkward guy. I don't know what do you think Tom Brady's post career is going to be? I don't really see him as a guy that I guess I could see him sort of as a middling, the 5th broadcast team on Fox. I don't know if he would take that job, but I don't really see him in the studio. He doesn't seem to have as much personality, but I am sort of thrilled at the idea. I was thinking of it. I think someone might have said something, or I read something about, did you read this article about we deserve better than Phil Simms for the Super Bowl?
No, I mean, I obviously understand, like everybody else, why that opinion would exist. Yeah. It's a great question about what Tom Brady does next, because he reminds me a little bit. You must know David Beckham, obviously, the soccer player. So the thing about David Beckham is that he's not sort of this really charismatic talker. So when he retired, he wasn't going to go into the media and be like, one of these guys who sits in a studio or, is a commentator on the TV or anything like that. and yet he didn't really sort of have the makeup to be a coach. I mean, he's a celebrity ultimately as much as he is a sportsman, so he wasn't going to go into coaching or do anything like that. And kind of everybody wondered what he was going to do next. And kind of David Beckham, all he's kind of done since he retired from football or soccer is a lot of charity work. And I could kind of see Tom Brady going down a similar path, because I can't really imagine him being part of the media. I can't imagine him being a coach. Whether or not he has enough money, I guess he and Giselle together could possibly like invest in a team, or be part owners in a franchise or something like that, maybe. But ultimately, I kind of just see him doing charity work or stuff like that. A bit like maybe he and David Beckham can get together and, I don't know, stop famine in Africa. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of what other famous quarterbacks have gone on to. I mean, obviously, some of the best, or some of the most notable, some of the best commentators. You've got Dan Fouts, and Steve Young does well in the booth, and I'm kind of curious. Joe Montana, though, I mean, I don't know what he does. He is obviously not a public figure. But Peyton Manning, the idea of Peyton Manning, I mean, he's got personality. He's got, I guess, somewhat of a soothing Southern accent. He's got as much knowledge as anyone in the game. I mean, maybe I don't know what he wants to do, whether it's coaching or something from the executive side. But if you told me that Peyton Manning was going to spend the next 30 years taking Phil Simms' spot at CBS, I mean, that wouldn't sound too bad to me.
I completely agree. I think
everything. That was some of what they were saying about we deserve better than Phil Simms. Because at first, when I saw that headline, I was like, that's just kind of mean. I mean, I don't know if he's not necessarily. I might agree with the premise, but it's sort of mean. But then he laid out like all of these detailed answers why, that it wasn't just an attack on him as a human being, but just like, so watching the Patriots and Broncos, Phil Simms actually said this, and then he said this, and then he said this, and he said this, and it was like, he never once gives you anything as far as analysis. He doesn't really dive deeper. He just sort of throws out a lot of cliche. It doesn't really mean anything.
It's hard because I like Phil Simms. When he comes on Brock and Salk on ESPN 710, I always find him, a pretty interesting guy to listen to. It's the sort of in-game pressures on, kind of respond to this play moment that he just makes so many mistakes. And I think that he and Jim Nantz are kind of like, they're very similar. So during the AFC Championship, Jim Nantz called Tom Brady Peyton Manning about 7 times. He was like, Manning has been sacked, and it was Tom Brady had been sacked. And it was all the way through the game. And Phil Simms will do similar stuff to that. I will say this, though, in defense of Phil Simms and Jim Nantz, I'm very fortunate that in England, I'm not a commentator on the level of those guys. They're broadcasting on the TV to sort of millions and millions of people all over the world. I'm a radio broadcaster.
Wait, are you color? Are you a comment? What is your role?
So I'm like the Jim Nantz
sort
of role, and I will have an ex-player or an ex-coach with me tomorrow. The game that I'm doing tomorrow, it's a coach who is with me, an ex-coach who's with me for the game. We will talk about it. And listen, I will make mistakes during, a broadcast, and will say things that are incorrect. And I'm rather fortunate because I'm on the radio. So unless you are sort of watching the game while you are listening to the broadcast, you will never know that I've made a mistake most of the time. Because these guys are sort of talking, and then there's instant replays and there's stuff like that. Mistakes happen. And I think it's to the credit of those who don't make mistakes. They are fantastic. I was amazed that there was a petition against Joe Buck and Troy Aikman, who I just think are, stunningly brilliant broadcasters, both of them. And, they very rarely make mistakes. And I would say the same for Mike Tirico. I think he and John Gruden are fantastic. Collinsworth and Al Michaels, just brilliant. And but it's a tough job. And unless you're kind of there and you do it perfectly every time, it's very easy to mock these guys. But it can be difficult. And if I was Phil Simms, I'm not sure that I would be able to deal with the weekly Twitter crisis that seems to go on. I think
Yeah.
I think it's good for Phil Simms that he's not on Twitter.
Well, I mean, as a writer, I mean, I spent most of my 20s, being the person that I wouldn't want to be if I could look back in hindsight, and I don't want to be that person. I wouldn't want to. I'm ashamed of some of the stuff that I may have thought about writers and stuff like that. That it's when you're on a certain side, you only see the end product, and then you're like, you're stupid, or you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about, and blah blah blah. And then when you're on the other side and you see all the rigmarole, and you see how you know what happens with editing, what happens with all sorts of other things that has to go on before it actually hits the page, before you read it, on your laptop or whatever, that there's so many other things that go into it that I am more sympathetic towards writers than I was in the past. Now, it doesn't mean I give all of them a pass, but that there is more that goes into it than you could possibly see from our side. That being said, I definitely think that there are, just like writers, there are commentators that I think are more enjoyable and pleasing to the ears than others. And if you've got the top 4 crews in the NFL right now, it's obviously, the number one guys being Tirico and Gruden, and then and Nance and Sims, Aikman and Buck, and Collinsworth and Michaels. And the order that those guys fall in, for me, it would definitely be Sims and Nance in number 4. And maybe that's a youth thing. I think that even then it's like Michaels and Collinsworth. They're definitely not young, but you don't feel like you're listening to 60-year-olds when you're watching them. I mean, Michaels makes some mistakes. Collinsworth, probably the most adept color commentary guy in the NFL. And, and he just knows everything about the game, and he's not boring. And then I think John Gruden, the least boring of anyone. Some of the stuff that he says is batshit insane, but definitely he's great, and I tune in every week. And Mike Tirico, almost underrated because he's overshadowed by Gruden, I think, most of the time. But Tirico, nobody's even really talking about Tirico as this guy that's ESPN's number one NFL money. This is the guy that's being listened to by 40 million people every single week for the biggest game in football and the biggest game in sports weekly. And I don't know if necessarily Mike Tirico lines up so in the same way that now Michaels does, but I think 10, 20 years down the line, we'll probably think of him in that same way. So when it comes to the Super Bowl, Sims and Nance, if CBS is going to have the Super Bowl, maybe a change could be coming in the future. And I think that if Peyton Manning is going to be putting his name in the hat, Phil Simms might want to. Phil Simms might be in danger. And that's sort of just a boring talk about.
You kind of wonder whether Matt Hasselbeck will sort of get into the act as well. When he retires, he's got to be in with it. Whether or not he would jump, right onto one of the, elite crews, I'm not sure. But I would say this, just appreciate if there are sort of fans out there who feel the angst about the crews. I would say appreciate what you've got, because the quality, as someone who sort of works in the same kind of industry, and I'm amazed at how good the NFL broadcasters are overall. There's one great, it's not a great line for the Seahawks, Kenny, but there's one sort of line that stuck with me. It was the timing was perfect. It was week 1, St. Louis against Seattle, and the Seahawks Marshawn Lynch has just been stuffed for a loss on 4th and 1 in overtime, and it ends the game. And I don't know who was doing the broadcast. I can't remember who was doing it, but the commentary was something along the lines of, sound familiar, the Seahawks cannot pick up a yard. And it was just the game after the Super Bowl, obviously, the very next game. And it was just the perfect line for that moment. And as painful as it was to hear, it encapsulated everything about the Seahawks at the time in that one sentence. And being able to deliver a lot. Broadcasters live for that one line that just sort of pops into your head. And that people will remember. And the crews in America are just so capable of capturing that moment. So I think Phil Simms makes mistakes. I can see why it's frustrating, but the overall quality is of all the different crews is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll see what happens this Sunday, Super Bowl Sunday, Broncos, Panthers. Rob's going with the Panthers. I'm going with the Broncos, but I think we're both really close on who's winning, and it's not really necessarily
I don't think there's a ton of confidence either way or the other. And that's sort of just the way that this game seems to be going. If the Seahawks were in the Super Bowl, Rob, how much confidence would you have if the Seahawks were in the Super Bowl?
I would have 100% confidence. Well, I actually, I would have 99% confidence. There would be, I wouldn't want to say 100, but I would be incredibly confident that that they were going to win the game. I wouldn't be contemplating anything other than a victory, because I would imagine they would do enough against the Denver defense to put up a few points, and I would expect the Seahawks defense to have a field day against that offensive line and Peyton Manning. So
yeah,
I would be feeling very, very good, and isn't that just a little bit more frustrating to think about? If they were there right now, they'd probably be very much the favorites to win it.
If only they had gone down 24-0. Who knows what we'd be talking about now. So that's it for 3000 NFL mock draft this week. We have, I've been on Real in the Field Goals. I've decided to start counting down to week 1 of the NFL season next year, and I think I'll start counting down to April 28th. The first round of the NFL draft here on 3000 NFL mock draft. However, that being said, I don't know yet what that is. I have to remember to do that next week, but a little less than 3 months away from the first round of the draft. Next, we got the Senior Bowl out of the way. Up next, sort of they got the Combine coming up, and we'll have lots to talk about then. Some more good guests coming up. Want to thank again our guest, USA Today's John Ledyard, for coming on and talking to us about the Senior Bowl, the Seahawks, and the draft. So follow Rob at Rob Staten, me at Kenneth Arthur S. Field Goals at Field Goals. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. You can donate through Patreon. I think you can hear now that there isn't a crinkly noise on my microphone, as some of you pointed out last week. That has been corrected. We're going to need to get some more new equipment to sort of fix that and all those sort of issues. I've made a workaround, but hopefully for the long term, if you want to donate to Patreon and even a couple bucks to both 3000 NFL mock draft as well as Real in the Field Goals, which will be coming up later this week. So look out for that. And there is nothing else left to be said, because we've already spent about 2 hours saying other stuff. So come back next week.